The morning Elara Voss signed her name on a marriage certificate next to a man she had spoken to fewer than a dozen times. The ink on the page felt heavier than anything she had ever lifted in her 22 years of living. The preacher had barely finished his last word before she turned to the tall, sun-weathered cowboy beside her, and said it plainly, without apology, the way a person speaks when they have decided that honesty is the only currency they have left to spend. "I married you for the ranch," she said. Cole Hatcher looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was steady, his gray eyes quiet, and the brim of his hat shadowed the upper half of his face just enough that she could not read everything in his expression. Then he gave a small nod, and his voice came low and without bitterness. "I know," he said. "That's fine." The preacher coughed awkwardly into his fist. The two witnesses, an elderly neighbor woman named Mrs. Potts and a ranch hand called Doug who smelled permanently of pine sap and horse sweat, exchanged a brief glance. Nobody said anything more. Cole picked up his hat from the pew beside him, settled it back on his head, and walked toward the chapel door, holding it open for his new wife with the same steady courtesy he might have offered a stranger at a general store. That was how it began. The year was 1878, and the town of Caldera Creek, Texas, sat in the dry bowl of a valley ringed by red bluffs that turned copper in the late afternoon sun. It was a working town, not a glamorous one. There was a post office, a livery stable, a saloon that doubled as the only place to get a hot meal after sundown, a doctor whose hands shook on cold mornings, and a land office whose records had been the source of more than one gunfight in the past decade. People came to Caldera Creek to work the land or to pass through on their way somewhere better, and those who stayed long enough usually ended up with dust in their boots, and a particular kind of stubborn pride that the place seemed to grow in people the way it grew mesquite. Elara had arrived 8 months earlier with her father, Bernard Voss, a man whose ambitions were always larger than his practical abilities. He had bought 600 acres of grassland on the eastern edge of the valley sight unseen through a broker in St. Louis, convinced that cattle ranching was the future and that he was precisely the man to seize it. What he found when he arrived was a property with good bones and hard problems. The soil was right, the water rights were decent, the grass was thick in the wet season. But the main house needed serious work. The fencing was broken in a dozen places. The cattle he had been promised were a third fewer than advertised, and the man he had hired as foreman had quit by the second week after a disagreement over wages. Bernard Voss was not a man built for physical labor or for the specific, grinding patience that ranching required. He was a man built for parlors and ledger books and conversations over brandy. He lasted 5 months before a bad chest cold turned into pneumonia, and Caldera Creek's shaking-handed doctor could not save him. He left behind his daughter, the ranch, and a debt of $840 owed to a bank in Austin. Elara was not a woman who fell apart easily. She had watched her father miscalculate too many times to have any romantic notions about the world arranging itself kindly for her. When she stood at his grave on a Tuesday in October with the red bluffs blazing orange behind her and the cold wind cutting across the grassland, she did not weep long. She allowed herself a short, private grief, and then she looked at the land and began to think. She knew the ranch had value. She knew she could not run it alone, not with the debt and the labor required and the cattle that still needed proper management. She knew that a woman alone on 600 acres in Texas in 1878 was a target for every kind of trouble there was. She also knew that she was not going to walk away from the only inheritance her father had left her, flawed and difficult as it was. She had begun asking quiet questions around town almost immediately. Who were the capable men? Who knew ranching? Who was honest? The name Cole Hatcher came up 3 times in 3 different conversations before she started paying real attention to it. Cole Hatcher was 28 years old and had been working ranches in the valley for the past 6 years. He had arrived in Caldera Creek the same way most drifting hands arrived, with a bedroll, a good horse, a reputation as a steady worker, and no particular plans beyond the season. But he had stayed. He was known as a man who understood cattle with an almost instinctive clarity, who could read grass and water and weather in ways that older ranchers respected. He did not drink to excess, did not start fights, paid his debts, and kept mostly to himself. He had saved a decent amount of money and had been quietly looking at buying land of his own, but good land was expensive and he was still short of what he needed. Elara had done her arithmetic with the clean practicality of a woman who had grown up watching her father fail at everything except conversation. The ranch needed a man who knew what he was doing. She needed the debt cleared and the operation stabilized. Cole Hatcher needed land. A marriage of arrangement was not uncommon in 1878. It was, in many circumstances, simply sensible. She had approached him through the land office of all places, where he had been inquiring about a smaller parcel to the north. She had walked in, waited for him to finish his conversation with the clerk, and then introduced herself and said she would like to speak with him about a business matter if he had a few minutes. He had looked at her with those calm gray eyes and said yes. They had sat on the bench outside the land office in the thin November sun, and she had laid it out plainly. Her situation, the debt, the ranch, what she needed, what she was prepared to offer. Marriage, legal and proper, his name on the deed beside hers. The ranch would be jointly owned, jointly run. She would have say in the business decisions and he would have authority over the cattle operation. She would not pretend it was anything other than what it was, but she would be a fair partner and an honest one. Cole had listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she was finished, he was quiet for what felt like a long time, looking out at the street where two horses were tied to the rail and a wagon was rolling past loaded with lumber. Then he looked back at her. "You've thought this through," he said. "Carefully," she said. Another pause. "All right," he said. That was November. They were married in December, on a morning so cold that their breath made small clouds in the chapel's unheated air. And Elara said her piece and Cole said his piece, and then she told him the plain truth because she felt she owed him at least that, and he received it with a quiet that was neither wounded nor resentful. "I know. That's fine." The ride back to the ranch from the chapel was about 4 miles, and they made it in a wagon with a canvas cover that did not do much against the wind. Cole drove and Elara sat beside him wrapped in a wool coat, and they talked about practical things. The fencing on the north pasture needed repair before the spring. He had arranged for a second ranch hand to come on in January, a young man from the next county named Tobias who had good references. The water trough near the barn was cracked and would need to be replaced before it froze through. It was a strange kind of wedding day, but it was also, she thought, an honest one. The house was a solid structure of rough-hewn timber with 4 rooms and a fireplace that drew well. Elara had spent the weeks before the wedding cleaning it from top to bottom and making it habitable. There was a main room that served as kitchen and sitting area, a separate bedroom, a small room her father had used as a study, and a storage room off the back. She had moved her father's things into the storage room and made the study into her own sleeping space, putting a cot there with a decent mattress and her few personal belongings arranged on a set of shelves she had put up herself. When they arrived and carried in Cole's things from his saddlebags and the small trunk he had tied in the wagon bed, she showed him the bedroom and said it was his. He set his trunk down inside it without comment. She made coffee on the iron stove and they sat at the kitchen table and went over the ranch ledger together for the first time, Cole leaning over the columns with the focused attention of a man reading a map, asking occasional questions that were all very practical and very good. The first week of their marriage was entirely businesslike. Cole was up before dawn every morning and did not come in from the range until dusk. He ate supper quickly and without much conversation, thanked her for the food, and went to bed. She was busy herself with the books, with letters to the bank in Austin negotiating a payment arrangement, with an inventory of the feed stores and the condition of the cattle. They were two people running parallel tracks toward the same destination, polite to each other and nothing more. She had expected this. She had not expected it to feel quite so lonely. It was not that she regretted the arrangement. She had entered it with clear eyes, and she still believed it was the right decision. But there was something in the particular quiet of the evenings, sitting at the table with her ledger, while Cole's lamp burned low in the bedroom, that made her aware of how entirely alone she had been since her father died, and how the presence of another person in the house did not necessarily cure that loneliness if the two of you were only ever talking about fence posts and feed bills. The second week brought the new ranch hand, Tobias, who turned out to be 20 years old and relentlessly cheerful in a way that brightened the mornings considerably. He had a wide, gap-toothed grin and an inexhaustible enthusiasm for any task given to him, and he and Cole developed a comfortable working rhythm quickly. Elara found herself enjoying Tobias's chatter at the lunch breaks, which she usually brought out to the two of them in the field when the weather permitted. It was during one of these lunch breaks, on a clear cold day in mid-January with the ground frozen hard, and the cattle clustered near the windbreak of cedar trees Cole had pointed out as an asset when he first looked the property over, that she saw something in Cole she had not quite noticed before. He was explaining something to Tobias about reading the behavior of the herd, about the way cattle positioned themselves relative to each other when they were anxious versus when they were settled, and his whole face had changed. The perpetual quiet reserve was still there, but underneath it was something lit up and alive. He spoke with a careful, patient thoroughness, the kind of teaching that came from genuine love of the subject, and when Tobias asked a question that showed he had understood what was being explained, Cole gave a small, real smile. It was brief, just a corner of the mouth turning up, almost immediately replaced by the usual composed expression, but it was entirely unguarded, and it changed his face completely. Elara sat on the tailgate of the wagon and watched this, and felt something she had not anticipated. Something curious and warm, the way you feel when you catch an unexpected glimpse of something beautiful through a window. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, and then told herself firmly to focus on the ledger. February brought the first real test of the partnership. A rancher 2 properties to the west, a man named Harlan Greer, sent one of his hands over with a message claiming that part of the fence line between his property and the Voss ranch was not where it should be, and that the survey Elara's father had accepted was in error, and that roughly 40 acres of the eastern corner of the Greer Range actually belonged to the Voss deed. Greer claimed the opposite, naturally. His claim was that the Voss survey was wrong, and the fence that had been put up in the summer was 30 yards too far west on the northern stretch. It was a land dispute, which in 1878 in Texas was a category of problem that could turn ugly in a number of different directions. Cole handled it with a steadiness that Elara found herself admiring even as she was quietly furious about the situation itself. He rode over to the land office with her that same afternoon, and they pulled the original survey records. The records were in their favor, but not unambiguously so, because one of the original survey markers appeared to have been moved, which was either an honest mistake or something less honest. "We need a surveyor to come out and reset the markers," Cole said, looking at the records spread on the clerk's desk. "That costs money," Elara said. "Less than a legal fight," he said, "and less than losing 40 acres. She looked at him. He was right. She knew he was right. "We can split the cost with Greer," Cole continued. "If he refuses, that tells us something about how confident he actually is in his own claim." "He'll refuse," she said. "He's not the sharing kind." Cole looked at her with a trace of that quiet, contained amusement she was beginning to recognize. "Then we pay for it ourselves and we walk the line with the surveyor, and whatever he marks is what we stand on." She nodded. "All right." She rode back with Cole in the late afternoon. the sun dropping orange and enormous behind the western bluffs, the road rutted and frozen beneath the wagon wheels. They were quiet most of the way, but it was a different quality of quiet than the first weeks had held. There was something easier in it. She found herself watching the silhouette of the red rock formations against the sunset sky, and thinking that this valley, difficult as it was, had a kind of stark beauty that she had not given herself permission to appreciate before. "Cole," she said, without planning to. He glanced at her. "I want you to know I'm grateful for how you handled that today. With Greer's man, you didn't let it escalate." He was quiet for a moment, the reins easy in his hands, the horses moving at their steady walking pace. "It doesn't help anything to escalate," he said. "Some men wouldn't see it that way. Some men," he said, "are more interested in proving something than in solving the problem." She thought about that. What were you proving by keeping it calm? He considered the question as if it deserved real thought. "Nothing," he said finally. "I didn't need to prove anything." She looked at his profile. The straight nose, the jaw shadowed with several days of dark stubble, the calm set of his mouth under the brim of the hat. He really was, she thought, a remarkably undemonstrative person. But there was nothing cold in it. It was more like steadiness, like a deep well. "I don't know very much about you," she said. He turned to look at her, and this time the contained amusement was fully visible, just barely around his eyes. "I know that," he said. She almost laughed. She did not quite manage it, but she felt it rise in her chest, surprising and warm. "That doesn't seem to bother you." "You'll learn what you need to know," he said, and turned his eyes back to the road. She sat with that for the rest of the ride and found, to her slight bewilderment, that she believed him. The surveyor came in early March and reset the markers after 2 days of careful work in the melting frost, and the line turned out to be where the Voss deed said it was. Harlan Greer was not gracious about it. He stopped Elara outside the post office 3 days later and told her that her late father had always known how to find a friendly surveyor, which was as close to calling her a cheat as he could manage while staying out of direct insult range. Elara kept her chin level and her voice steady, and told him that she hoped the documentation from the land office satisfied his concerns, and went inside to collect her mail. Her hands were shaking a little when she unfolded the letter she had been waiting for from the bank in Austin, but not because of the confrontation. She had offered the bank a payment plan, staggered over 18 months, to clear her father's debt. The letter informed her that they were willing to accept the arrangement if the first payment of $200 was received by the 1st of April. $200 by the 1st of April. She had 4 weeks, and she had $73 in the ranch account. She rode home and sat at the kitchen table and stared at the numbers in the ledger for a long time. Then she heard Cole come in through the back door, stomp the mud from his boots and hang up his coat. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She showed him the letter. He read it, set it down, and sat across from her. "We could sell 2 of the older steers," he said after a moment. "That gets us to maybe 110, she said. "There's the spring cattle auction in Delaney in 3 weeks. If we bring 6 head, we could make up the difference, maybe more if the prices are decent." She looked at him. "That's 6 head we could be selling in summer at better prices." "Better prices that don't help us if the bank calls the debt before summer," he said, not unkindly. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. The timber there had a long diagonal crack that she had been meaning to have looked at. "You're right," she said for the second time in a month, and she was finding that saying it to him was easier than she would have expected. He was not the kind of man who gloated at being right. He just moved on to the next thing. "The auction's a 4-day trip," he said. "I'll take Tobias." "I'm coming," she said. He looked at her steadily. "It's my ranch too," she said, "and I want to see how the auction works. I need to understand it if I'm going to be running this place properly." A beat of silence. Then, "All right." The cattle drive to Delaney was the first time Elara had been more than 10 miles from Caldera Creek since her father's funeral, and she found, to her own surprise, that something in her lightened the moment they were moving. They left before dawn, the cattle cooperative in the cold morning air, Tobias riding point and Cole and Elara at the flanks. The sky turned from black to deep purple to a spreading orange that made the whole valley glow, and the cattle moved through it in a slow, dark river, and Elara felt alive in a way she had not in months. The first day was long, and the second day was harder because of a creek crossing that took the better part of 2 hours, and resulted in Elara getting her left boot thoroughly soaked when her horse misjudged a step on the rocky bottom. She said something very unladylike when the cold water hit her foot, and Tobias stared at her in absolute delight, and Cole turned just enough that she caught the side of his face and saw that he was smiling for real this time, not the contained, barely their version, but an actual full smile that creased the corners of his eyes and made him look younger and entirely different. "I'll pretend I didn't hear that," he said. "You will do no such thing," she said, because she was cold and wet and amused at herself. "I earned that word and I'll stand by it." He laughed. It was short and low, but it was real, and it startled her more than the cold creek water had. She had not heard him laugh before. It was a good sound. They made camp on the second night in a hollow out of the wind, with a fire that Tobias built with the same cheerful competence he applied to everything. And they ate beans and salt pork and drank coffee that was thick as mud, and Elara sat on her bedroll with her damp boot, propped near the fire, and listened to Cole and Tobias talk about the cattle market, and the weather and a horse Tobias had known as a boy that he spoke of with an affection that made her smile. After Tobias fell asleep on his side of the fire, she and Cole sat in the firelight for a while in silence that was, by now, the comfortable kind. The stars overhead were enormous and brilliant, and the horses were settled and the cattle were quiet on the picket line. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. He looked at her across the fire. The light made his face different, softened the usual composure into something more open. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Anything. Where you grew up." He was quiet for a moment. "Missouri," he said. "Small town east of Kansas City. My father had a hardware store." "How did you end up here?" "Came out at 18 looking for something different." A pause. "Found it." "Do you miss Missouri?" "No," he said, and it was perfectly simple and true. "What did you want when you came west?" She asked. Before the land plan, he thought about it. "Room," he said. "I wanted room to think, to work, to not have somebody standing next to you at every moment." She understood that, actually, more than she would have said out loud to most people. "You're not very like your father," he said, and it was not an accusation, just an observation. She looked up at him. "How do you mean?" "The men in town talked about him. Friendly, lots of big plans, not much follow-through. You're different." She smiled slightly. "I loved him," she said. "He was kind and he meant well, but yes, I'm different." "That's good," Cole said, "for the ranch." She held his gaze for a moment longer than she needed to. The firelight was making it harder to maintain her practical composure about this man, because the firelight had no interest in practicality. It was interested in the exact angle of his jaw and the way his eyes were not just gray but complicated, with darker depths, and the fact that he had just, without any artifice at all, given her something true about himself. "Thank you," she said, "for coming here, for this, for being what you are." He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, and she thought for a moment that he was going to say something significant, but instead he said, quietly, "Get some sleep. Long day tomorrow." She lay down on her bedroll and looked at the stars and felt her heart doing something inconvenient that she decided to think about later. The auction in Delaney was everything she had hoped it would be in terms of education. It was loud and fast and organized in ways that were not obvious until you understood the system, and Cole moved through it with the comfortable authority of someone who understood all the moving pieces. He knew how to position their cattle, how to read the buyers, when to push and when to wait. Their 6 heads sold for $262, which was better than they had needed and better than Cole had projected, and he was quietly pleased about it in a way that manifested as slightly more conversation than usual on the ride home. She made the bank payment with $42 to spare. Spring came to Caldera Creek in the way it always did in that part of Texas, in a rush of green over the hillsides, and a sudden explosion of wildflowers along the creek banks that lasted about 3 weeks before the summer heat burned them back. The ranch breathed and expanded with the season. The cattle were fattening on the spring grass. The fencing repairs were nearly complete. Tobias had proven himself reliable enough that Cole had begun teaching him more advanced aspects of herd management. Elara's days had a shape to them now, a rhythm that felt almost like something she could trust. She was up early, managed the household and the books in the mornings, brought lunch to the field more often than not, and in the afternoons worked on the administrative side of the ranch, the correspondence with suppliers and buyers, the relationship with the bank, the records. She had also, almost without noticing it, started riding out with Cole in the late afternoons to check the herd, which was supposedly to keep herself informed but which she would have been hard-pressed to claim was purely businesslike. They talked on those rides, more than they had talked before and about more things. She learned that he had 2 younger sisters back in Missouri, both married now, and that he wrote to them occasionally. That he had worked 4 different ranches in Texas before Caldera Creek, and that each one had taught him something specific and useful. That he had once seen a tornado from close enough to describe the sound of it in a way that made the hair stand up on her arms. That he liked to read when he could find books, which was not often enough. That he had a dry, quiet sense of humor that emerged in moments when she was not expecting it and always caught her off guard and always made her laugh. She told him things in return, about growing up in St. Louis, about her mother, who had died when Elara was 12, which was when she had started being the practical, managing person in the family by necessity. About the year she had worked as a bookkeeper for a merchant in order to help pay her father's debts the first time he ran up a significant deficit before the ranch dream. About the things she loved, which included mathematics, which surprised him, and stargazing, which did not, and the smell of rain on dry ground. Petrichor, he said when she said the last one. She stared at him. You know that word. I told you I like to read, he said. She was charmed by this in a way that felt very dangerous. She was becoming very charmed by him in general in a way that felt dangerous. And the logical part of her brain that had arranged this whole sensible transaction was beginning to have a quiet, increasingly urgent argument with the part of her that noticed things like the way he handed her the reins when they dismounted or the particular quality of his attention when she was speaking, which was total and unhurried and felt, in an unsettling way, like being genuinely seen. She had not factored this in. She had been very careful to not factor this in. In late April, they had their first real argument. It was about the north pasture, which Cole wanted to leave fallow for the season to let the grass recover from the previous year's overgrazing by her father's poorly managed herd. Elara's calculation was that they needed the full grazing capacity to maximize the herd's weight gain before the summer auction, and that leaving the north pasture unused was a loss they could not afford in the second year of trying to stabilize the operation. They argued about it at the kitchen table after supper on a Tuesday, with the lamp burning between them and both of them more heated than they had been in any previous conversation. Cole's steady composure had a line in it, she discovered, and it was somewhere around the point where he felt a management decision was going to damage the land, because the land was something he felt about the way other people felt about family. If we push the whole herd through the east and south pastures all summer, those pastures will be in the same condition the north pasture is in now by fall, he said. And then we have 3 degraded pastures instead of 1, and a problem that takes years to fix. If we don't make the numbers for the summer auction, we don't make the second bank payment, she said. And then we don't have any pastures because the bank owns them. We can make the numbers without the north pasture if we're careful with the rotation. Can we, or do you think we can? He was quiet for a moment, and she could see that the distinction landed because it was a fair one and he was honest enough to acknowledge it. I think we can, he said. I won't claim it's certain. I need it to be more than a thought, she said. Ranching is never more than a well-informed thought, he said, and there was a controlled intensity in his voice that she had not heard before. If you want certainty, this is the wrong business. I know that, she said. I've been running the numbers on this business since before you were part of it. There was a pause that had some edge to it. I know you have, he said more quietly, and your numbers are right about what we need. My argument is about what happens to the land if we burn it down to make this year's payment and lose the capacity to make next year's. She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp flame moved slightly in some draft from under the door. Show me the rotation plan, she said. He got up and went to get a piece of paper and a pencil and came back and sat down and began drawing. And they worked at it for 2 hours at the kitchen table, going over every calculation, every estimate of grazing days and grass recovery rates and projected weight gains. It was the most productive 2 hours they had spent together since the auction, and by the end of it she had agreed to the fallow north pasture because his plan, when fully laid out, was persuasive, and he had agreed to a specific set of numbers that he would hit by the summer auction or they would revisit the decision. When it was over and the paper was covered in calculations and the coffee had gone cold, she leaned back in her chair and looked at him across the table and said, "You really love this land." He glanced up from the paper. "Yes," he said, "not just as an asset, you love the actual thing." He considered this for a moment. "It's honest," he said. "The land does what it does. It doesn't pretend." She felt that go somewhere quiet and deep in her chest. "No," she said softly, "I suppose it doesn't." She went to bed that night with a feeling she was running out of room to not name. The summer was hard and beautiful and full. The rotation plan worked, which she acknowledged to Cole with the same directness she brought to everything, and he accepted it with a nod and a quiet satisfaction that was more gratifying to witness than any loud celebration would have been. Tobias brought on a second young hand for the summer, a quiet 16-year-old nephew of his, which Elara appreciated even if the boy, named Eli, was so shy he barely spoke for the first month. Harlan Greer tried twice more to cause trouble, once by letting his cattle drift onto the Voss property through a section of fence he claimed had been left open, and once by spreading a rumor in town that the Voss ranch had water rights issues that would affect its value. Both efforts came to nothing. The fence issue was addressed by Cole with a directness that was neither aggressive nor deniable, and the water rights rumor was killed when Elara went to the land office personally and pulled the documentation and had the clerk write a formal statement of record. Greer subsided after that, at least for the time being, in the way that certain kinds of bullies do when they realize the target is not going to fold. It was in July, on a Sunday afternoon when the heat was enormous and flat and the whole valley shimmered with it, that the shift happened. Not gradually, which was how it had been building for months, but in a single moment that was so simple she almost missed it. She was sitting on the front porch in the only shade available, trying to read a week-old newspaper from San Antonio, and Cole came around the corner of the house from the barn with his sleeves rolled up and his hat in his hand, and he stopped when he saw her. "Greer's south fence is down in 2 places," he said. "His cattle are going to drift into our east pasture before evening if nobody deals with it." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Go fix it," he said. She looked at him. "His fence?" "Yes." "Why?" He settled his hat back on his head. "Because his cattle in our east pasture is a problem for us regardless of whose fault the fence is, and because doing it doesn't cost me anything except an hour and not doing it costs us more." She watched him walk toward the barn to saddle his horse, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost stunning, that she had married a genuinely good man. Not a perfect man, not a man without edges or opinions, but a man whose fundamental orientation toward the world was quiet, principled decency. And she had done it for entirely transactional reasons, and she was now sitting on a porch in the July heat understanding, with every part of herself, that she had fallen in love with him somewhere between the creek crossing and the kitchen table and all those evening rides through the prairie grass. She folded the newspaper. She got up and went to the barn and saddled her own horse. "I'm coming," she said. He looked at her from where he was tightening his saddle cinch. "You don't have to." "I know," she said. They fixed Greer's fence together, which took exactly an hour and 12 minutes by her count, working in the long bronze light of the July afternoon with the sweat sticking their clothes to them and the cattle lowing distantly in the heat. They worked well together. She had come to know that. There was a wordless efficiency between them that had developed over months, each knowing what the other needed before it was asked, moving around each other without collision. When the last post was solid, Cole hammered the staple into the wire and stood back and looked at it and then looked at her. She was pushing a damp strand of hair back from her forehead and squinting in the light, and she became aware that he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, something unguarded and careful at the same time, as if he was calculating something and not quite decided. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and turned to get his horse. But she had seen it, and she thought about it all the way home and through supper, and after supper when she was sitting at the table with her ledger, and he was reading the Bible, one of the 2 books that had come in his trunk, at the other end of the table. The lamp made the room warm and gold. "Cole," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. He looked up. She put her pen down. She had been rehearsing something, some arrangement of words that was fair and honest without being terrifying. But when he looked at her with those steady gray eyes, she found that all of it had gone out of reach. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to know that I'm telling you because it's true and not because I expect anything in return." He set the Bible down. His full attention was on her in that complete, unhurried way of his. "I know why I married you," she said, "and the reason I told you was true when I said it, but it isn't the only truth now." The lamplight. The quiet house. A cricket somewhere in the walls. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have come to feel more than I planned to." The silence stretched just long enough that she thought perhaps she had made a terrible mistake, but she held herself still and waited. Cole was looking at her with that expression that was not quite readable, the one she had seen at Greer's fence, and then he stood up from the table and crossed to where she was sitting and crouched down beside her chair, so that they were level with each other, which was something she had never seen him do. This deliberate, careful act of making himself equal to her eye line. "Elara," he said, and the way he said her name in that quiet, serious voice was itself a whole sentence. "Yes," she said. "I have been entirely sure of my own feelings since about February," he said. "I didn't say anything because our arrangement was yours to change or not change and I wasn't going to push." She stared at him. "Since February," she said. "The lunch break," he said. "With Tobias. You were sitting on the tailgate." She thought back to that day, the cold January air and the cedar windbreak and Tobias's gap-toothed grin, and she remembered catching that unguarded smile on Cole's face and feeling something warm and curious move through her. She had not thought he was watching her at the same time. "That was January," she said. "Late January," he said. "I may have rounded to February." She laughed, startled, and he smiled, that full, real smile that changed his whole face, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw and felt his breath pause briefly against her palm. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," he said. "I was giving you room." She looked at him very carefully. "You have always given me room," she said. "You needed it. I'm telling you," she said softly, "that I don't need it anymore." He covered her hand with his, holding it against his face, and looked at her with something so entirely open that it made her chest ache. "I hear you," he said. The summer turned from the inside out after that. The days looked the same to anyone watching from the outside, the same work, the same routine, the same 2 people moving efficiently around the same ranch. But the inside of it was entirely different. There was a current between them that had always been building and was now acknowledged, and the acknowledgement changed everything. The way he stopped beside her at the kitchen counter, where their shoulders nearly touched, and neither of them moved away. The evenings on the porch watching the sky go dark, sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. The night she reached across the kitchen table and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers properly, and they sat like that for a while talking about nothing important. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in early August, leaning against the paddock fence after they had brought the horses in. A quiet and unhurried kiss that was very much like him, careful and sure and more thorough than brief. She had both hands on the front of his shirt when it was done, and he had one hand in her hair, and they were both very still for a moment in the dusk with the horses settling behind them. "We're still a partnership," she said, because she needed to say it. "Of course," he said. "The ranch is still half mine." "It will always be half yours," he said, and he meant it, and she knew he meant it. She leaned her forehead against his chest and felt his arms come around her, and thought that this had all been a very long and unusual road to get to something as simple as standing in a paddock at dusk with someone who fit like a good piece of land, solid and right and full of growing things. August brought the summer auction in Delaney, which they attended again, this time with 14 head and a confidence in their numbers that the previous trip had not carried. Cole's rotation plan had done exactly what he said it would. The cattle were heavier than projected, and the prices were better than the previous spring. They cleared the second bank payment with enough left over to repair the barn roof, which had been on the list since January, and to order a proper water pump that would replace the hand-drawn system that had been causing problems all summer. On the second night of the Delaney trip, with Tobias snoring peacefully on his side of the fire and the stars blazing overhead, Cole and Elara sat close together on his bedroll with her head on his shoulder, and he told her more of himself than he had ever offered at once. About the thing that had driven him west at 18, which was not just a desire for room but a specific incident. A season in Missouri when a bad harvest had broken his father down into a man who drank, and the way that had broken something in their family that had never fully healed, and how he had left not because he did not love them, but because he had known with complete certainty that if he stayed, he would either fix it or be destroyed by trying, and he was not sure at 18 which was more likely. "And your father now?" she asked. "He stopped drinking about 4 years after I left," Cole said. "My younger sister wrote me. He's steady now. Older. We write sometimes." "Is it all right between you?" "It's as all right as it can be," he said. "Not everything heals completely, but it's not broken anymore." She was quiet for a while, listening to the fire settle. "I think," she said slowly, "that the reason you're so good with the land is the same reason you were so good with me." He looked down at her. "How do you mean?" "You understand that broken things take time," she said, "and that you can't force the growing. You can only create the conditions." He was very still for a moment. Then he pressed his lips to the top of her head just once, quiet and deliberate. "You weren't broken," he said. "I was a little broken," she said honestly. "When I walked into that land office. You were clear-eyed and practical and you knew what you needed," he said. "That's not broken. That's strong." She sat with that for a long time, warmed by it in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. They came home from Delaney to a letter that had arrived while they were gone. It was from Cole's younger sister Clara in Missouri, full of family news and warmth and an unmistakable curiosity about his wife, whom he had written to inform them about in the spring. Elara sat at the kitchen table and read the letter over Cole's shoulder and felt something settle further into place in her chest at the evidence that he had people who loved him and that those people were glad he had found something good. "She wants to know if I'm kind," Elara said, reading. "What?" Cole said. "She doesn't say it that directly, but that's what she's asking." Elara pointed to the relevant paragraph. "She says she hopes you've found someone who appreciates what you put into things." "That's the same question." Cole read the paragraph. He looked at her sideways. "Are you going to answer her?" "May I?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. She wrote to Clara that evening, 4 pages, which was more than she had intended to write, and mailed it from the Caldera Creek post office the next day. Clara's response arrived 3 weeks later and contained 2 pages of warm, direct, funny writing that established immediately that they would be friends, which was a thing Elara had not known she was lacking until she had it. September was the month that Harlan Greer made his last and most serious move. He hired a lawyer from Austin, a man named Pendleton, to file a formal claim against the Voss deed, arguing an error in the original land grant that predated both the Voss purchase and the survey resolution from March. It was the kind of legal maneuver that was expensive to counter and designed to be a nuisance at minimum and a threat to the whole property at maximum. Elara read the claim documents twice, very carefully, and felt a cold, settled anger that was nothing like panic. Then she went out to the barn and told Cole. He read the documents standing against the stall partition with the horses moving quietly around him. His expression was controlled, but she had learned to read the fine variations in his composure by now, and she could see the tight line of his jaw. "He's not going to get anywhere with this," she said. "The grant is solid. Pendleton knows it. This is harassment." "Harassment that costs money to address," Cole said. "I know, but we have some buffer now after the summer." He folded the documents and handed them back to her. "What do you want to do?" She had been thinking about it since she read the papers. "There's a lawyer in Caldera Creek, Walcott. He's competent. I want to hire him to file a formal response and to go on record with the land office that this claim is without merit. I want to make it expensive and annoying for Greer to pursue it the same way he's making it expensive and annoying for us." Cole looked at her for a moment. "You want to fight back?" "I want to fight back correctly," she said. "Not loudly, not messily, just thoroughly." "That's the right move," he said. "I know," she said, and the echo of the early conversations in their marriage made them both briefly quiet, remembering. She hired Walcott the next morning and spent 2 hours in his office going over every document related to the original land grant. Walcott was a methodical man who smelled of pipe tobacco and kept his files in an organizational system that she found genuinely impressive, and he confirmed her reading of the grant within 20 minutes of reviewing it. "This claim has no legs," he said, "but you're right that it needs to be formally dismissed rather than ignored. I'll have a response filed by the end of the week." "I'd also like a letter sent directly to Pendleton," she said, noting the full history of the survey dispute from March and Greer's pattern of attempted encroachment. Walcott looked at her over his spectacles. "That's pointed," he said. "Yes," she said. The legal matter resolved itself over the following 6 weeks, which was faster than she had expected, mostly because Pendleton apparently decided that the Voss ranch was more trouble than Greer was worth, and withdrew the claim with minimal ceremony. Walcott sent her a note that said simply, "As expected. Regards, Walcott," and she read it at the breakfast table and passed it to Cole and felt the last chronic tension of the year begin to release from her shoulders. "He's done," she said. Cole drank his coffee and looked at the note. "For now. Permanently, I think," she said. "He's realized we won't be moved." "You won't be moved," Cole said, and there was a particular warmth in the way he said it that made her meet his eyes across the table, and he was looking at her with an admiration that was entirely unguarded and made her feel briefly like the valley at sunset. October came, a year from Bernard Voss's death, and the ranch had changed enormously. The fences were all repaired and properly mapped. The herd was larger and better conditioned than it had been when Cole arrived. The barn roof no longer leaked. The water pump worked. The house had been incrementally improved over the year in ways that had accumulated into something that felt like a real home, which was a thing Elara had not had since she was 12 years old. She stood at her father's grave on a Tuesday morning, because it had been a Tuesday when she buried him, and the red bluffs were blazing orange behind her exactly as they had been then, and the cold wind was cutting across the grassland. She felt the grief freshly for a few minutes, the way grief requires even after you have made your peace with it, and then she felt something else, which was gratitude. For this land he had left her. For the fact that his impractical dreaming had brought her to this specific valley where everything had been harder and better than anything she had planned. She heard a horse and turned, and Cole rode up and dismounted beside her, and stood with his hat in his hands in the quiet way of a man who understood that you could simply be present at someone's grief without filling it with words. After a few minutes she reached over and took his hand. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I figured you'd want company," he said. "I wasn't sure." "I did," she said. "I didn't know it until you got here." He held her hand and they stood at her father's grave as the morning warmed around them, and she thought that this was perhaps the most intimate moment they had shared, more intimate than the kisses or the long firelit conversations, because it was so quiet and so honest. There was nothing here but what was true. "He would have liked you," she said finally. "He liked steady people. They made him feel safe." "From what I heard, he was a good man to know," Cole said. "He was," she said. "He was genuinely kind. He just never quite understood the difference between wanting something and being able to do it." "Not the worst flaw a man can have," Cole said. "No," she agreed. "There are worse ones." She looked at the simple wooden marker and said goodbye to her father in her own private way, and then turned toward the horses, and Cole walked beside her with his hand easy at her back, and the valley spread out ahead of them green and gold and enormous in the October light. November brought the first anniversary of their wedding, and it arrived on a cold morning that was very much like the morning of the ceremony itself, with the sky that particular deep blue of winter in the Texas hill country and their breath making small clouds in the kitchen air before the stove had warmed the room. Elara had not mentioned it. She was not sure whether Cole had remembered, and she was not sure how she wanted to treat it, given that the wedding itself had been what it had been. But when she came into the kitchen, there was a small package wrapped in brown paper on the table beside her usual coffee cup, and Cole was at the stove with his back to her. She sat down and looked at the package for a moment, something blooming in her chest. "What is this?" she said. He brought the coffee over and sat across from her. "Open it," he said. Inside the paper was a book, a proper bound book, not a Bible or a practical manual, but a collection of poetry, Tennyson, the pages clean and unread. She turned it over in her hands and looked up at him. "Where did you get this?" "Caldera Creek did not have a bookstore." "Ordered it from San Antonio," he said. 2 months ago. 2 months ago. He had been thinking about this 2 months ago. She set the book down carefully and looked at him across the table with everything she felt in her face, not trying to manage it for once, just letting it be there. "You ordered a book of poetry 2 months in advance," she said. "You said you loved stargazing," he said. "Tennyson writes about stars." She felt her eyes go warm and blinked it back and said, "I have something for you too. I was going to give it to you tonight." She went to her room and came back with the deed document that she had spent 3 weeks preparing with Walcott. It was a formal amendment to the property deed, removing the joint ownership structure they had started with and replacing it with a clean, full co-ownership declaration that had his name first, which had required some creative work with Walcott because the original deed had her name first, and she had had to explain to the lawyer, who was perplexed by the whole thing, that this was important to her. Cole looked at the document for a long time. "Your name first," he said. "You built this as much as I did," she said. "More, in ways I'm still learning. I wanted your name there as a full partner, not an addition." He looked at her with an expression that was more open than she had ever seen on him, more undefended, and she saw what it meant to him, this man who had come west at 18 wanting room and land and something honest to work on, and who had found all of it here in this particular valley, in this particular life. "Elara," he said, and stopped. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that from the first day you told me the plain truth in that chapel, I respected you more than most people I've known in my life. And that respect turned into something considerably larger than I knew how to manage for a while. And I am very glad you organized this whole thing, because I would not have managed to arrive at this on my own." She laughed at that, genuinely and fully, and he smiled his full real smile across the table with the morning light coming in through the kitchen window and the coffee warming between them and the book of Tennyson on the table and the amended deed beside it. "We're a good team," she said. "We are," he said. "The best I've ever been part of." She reached across and took his hand and held it, and they sat in the good, warm quiet of the morning, and let the first year of their entirely unusual marriage close around them like a door gently pulled shut. Winter settled over Caldera Creek and the Hatcher Ranch, as they had begun to call it informally, though the deed said both their names, and life had a particular sweetness in the cold months that Elara had not experienced before. The work was slower in winter, the days shorter, the evenings longer, and those evenings became the thing she loved best about the whole arrangement of her life. Cole had taken to reading aloud from the Tennyson after supper, which she had not asked for and had not expected, and which moved her enormously. He read the way he did everything, carefully and with attention, not performing but simply sharing something he was finding genuine pleasure in. She sat across from him, or sometimes beside him on the narrow settee they had brought in from the storage room and placed in the main room in October, and she listened to the poems and watched his face and thought about all the ways this man was different from what she had expected when she made her practical calculation. Tobias came for Christmas, bringing a bottle of bourbon and a fruit cake his mother had made, and Eli came with him, considerably less shy than he had been in August, and they all had Christmas dinner at the large kitchen table with the extra leaf in, and there was more laughter around that table than the house had held in all of its previous existence combined. Cole told a story about his first winter in Texas at the age of 20 that involved a horse, a frozen creek, and a miscalculation about the stability of ice that had everyone crying with laughter by the end. And Elara sat at the opposite end of the table from him and looked at the full warmth of his laughing face and thought, with a happiness so uncomplicated it was almost startling, that this was her life. In January, on a Sunday when the sky was low and gray and a cold rain was tapping at the windows, she told him that she thought she was expecting. She told him quietly, sitting on the settee after supper with the lamp turned low and the rain steady outside, because she wanted to tell him in a moment of peace rather than a moment of drama. She was not entirely certain yet. It was early, but the signs were clear enough that she was confident. Cole was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her with an expression that she had no previous category for, something vast and careful and incredibly gentle all at once. "Are you all right?" He said first. It was very much like him that this was the first question. "Yes," she said. "I'm well, I'm fine, a little tired but otherwise." He held her gaze for another moment, and then he put his arm around her and she settled into his side, and the rain came down outside and the lamp burned low and he said nothing for a while, which was also very much like him, and then said quietly, "Good." She smiled against his shoulder. "Just good." "Very good," he said, and she could hear the contained enormity of it in those two words, the thing that did not need amplification because it was too real and too large for decoration. "We should go to town and see Dr. Reeves," she said. "His hands don't shake as much since October," Cole said. "He told me he's been sleeping better." "That is not entirely reassuring," she said. "It's the best we have," he said, "and he delivered 37 children in this valley without losing one." She considered this. "All right," she said. "Dr. Reeves." They went to Dr. Reeves the following Tuesday, and he confirmed everything with the brisk competence of a man who had been doing this for 20 years, shaking hands and all, and told her the baby would come in late August or early September, which was the harvest season and moderately inconvenient, and that she should eat well and not do anything too strenuous, which Cole took with a seriousness that over the following weeks manifested as a quiet but total rearrangement of the ranch work so that nothing requiring significant physical effort fell to her. She argued with him about this. "I am not an invalid," she said. "I'm going to have a baby in 8 months. I can still work." "I know you can," he said. "I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying I'd rather you didn't carry the water pails from the barn. The water pails are not strenuous. They're 30 pounds each," he said. "Cole." "Elara." He looked at her with the patient, immovable expression she had come to recognize as the indication that he had thought this through and was not going to move. "Let Tobias carry the water pails." She looked at him for a long moment. "This is going to be a long 8 months," she said. "9," he said, and went back to what he was doing. She did let Tobias carry the water pails, mostly because she appreciated that Cole never actually told her she couldn't do things, only suggested alternatives, and because she had learned over the past year that his protectiveness was not the controlling kind but the caring kind, rooted in actual regard rather than in any desire to limit her. Spring came and the ranch hummed with its second growing season under their joint management, and it was better than the first in every measurable way. The herd was larger and better conditioned. The pastures were exactly as Cole had predicted they would be after the fallow year. There were 2 new horses, a purchase they had planned carefully over the winter, and a third hand coming on for the summer season, a steady man in his 30s named Holt who had worked 3 ranches to the south and came highly recommended by 2 men whose opinions Cole trusted. Elara was showing by May, which made the rides less comfortable, but she kept riding anyway until June, when Cole said nothing directly but watched her dismount one afternoon with a wince she could not quite hide and said, "What if we take the wagon instead of riding out tomorrow?" with enough gentleness in his voice that she agreed without the usual argument. She wrote to Clara in Missouri and told her, and Clara's reply was a 6-page explosion of warmth and advice and excitement that made Elara laugh out loud at the kitchen table, and she read the best parts to Cole that evening. Clara had 2 children herself and was expecting a third in the fall, which meant that she and Elara would both be new mothers in the same season, a fact that Clara found enormously entertaining and wrote about with a cheerful, irreverent humor that Elara had come to love about her. "She says she hopes it's a boy," Elara told Cole, reading. "What do you hope?" he said, without looking up from the ledger he was reviewing. She thought about it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just hope they're well." He looked up. "Then that's what matters," he said. She folded Clara's letter and put it with the others in the small box she kept on the shelf in her room, which now held 12 letters from Clara and 3 from Cole's other sister, Margaret, in Missouri, and 2 from Mrs. Potts, the elderly witness at their wedding who had turned out to be a remarkable correspondent with strong opinions about everything and an infectious enthusiasm for their cattle operation. August was hot and the days were long, and Elara was tired in a way that was different from any tiredness she had known, a deep-seated physical demand that she had to negotiate each morning. Cole was steady and present and unutterably good about all of it in the quiet way that was his whole manner. He brought her cold water and did not mention it. He got up in the night when she could not sleep and sat with her in the kitchen, and sometimes read aloud and sometimes just talked and sometimes said nothing at all, which was usually what she needed. The baby came on the 2nd day of September, which was a Wednesday, and Dr. Reeves arrived with his bag and his steadier-than-average hands, and the whole process was long and demanding in the way of all such things, and Cole sat on the other side of the door for 5.5 hours in a state that Tobias described afterward as the most frightening sustained stillness he had ever witnessed. The baby was a boy, 8 pounds and 2 ounces, entirely healthy and possessed of a pair of lungs that made his presence known to everyone within a significant radius. Elara heard Dr. Reeves announce this through her exhaustion, and felt a love so enormous it seemed to restructure something fundamental in her chest. When Cole was allowed into the room, he crossed to her in 3 quiet strides and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her first, just her face, for a long moment, checking. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask. "You're more than fine," he said, and his voice was lower than usual, rough at the edges in a way it never was, and she understood that he was barely holding himself together. She put the baby in his arms and watched him look down at his son for the first time, and she did not try to hold back her tears at the expression on his face, which was the most entirely open thing she had ever seen on a person who had spent a lifetime in composed containment, an absolute astonishment of love. "What do we name him?" she said softly. Cole looked up at her. His eyes were bright. "What do you want?" he said. She had been thinking about it. "James," she said, "for your father." He was silent for a moment, and she saw the thing that moved through him at this, the complicated tenderness of it. James, he said, looking back at the baby. James Bernard Hatcher, she said. If that's all right, for both our fathers. He looked at her, and she could see that he was not going to manage words for a moment, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw in the way she had done on that first kitchen evening, and he covered it with his hand, and they sat like that with the baby between them while the September sun came through the window and lay gold across the bed. The town of Caldera Creek, as it turned out, was not opposed to celebrating the arrival of a Hatcher baby. Mrs. Potts arrived within 24 hours with a quilt and a casserole, and enough opinions about infant care to fill a modest volume. Tobias appeared with Eli and Holt and a somewhat excessive amount of firewood, stacked so neatly against the house that it was clearly someone's way of expressing feelings they did not have the vocabulary for. Walcott, the lawyer, sent a formal note of congratulations that was entirely lawyerly and somehow very warm. Even the clerk at the land office, a thin young man named Abbott who was generally reserved, sent a card. It was, Elara thought, as she sat in the kitchen 3 days after James arrived, nursing him in the morning quiet before Cole was up, what belonging to a place looked like. You did not notice it building. You went about your work and your arguments and your hard seasons, and one day you looked up and found that a community had formed around you the way prairie grass forms around a creek, quietly, without announcement, drawn by the same basic forces of water and root. She heard Cole's footsteps in the hall, the particular pattern of them she knew now the way she knew her own name, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, and stopped when he saw her. He looked at her and James in the warm kitchen light for a long-held moment, and the expression on his face was the simplest and most complete she had seen on him yet. "Coffee's not started," she said. "I'll start it," he said, and came into the kitchen and put the kettle on and moved around behind her to look at the baby over her shoulder, his hand warm on her back, and then he pressed a kiss to the side of her head, which was a thing he did often now, and which she had come to require the way she required the morning coffee. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like a potato," Cole said. She laughed, startled, and James stirred at the noise and made a small, dissatisfied sound, and she settled him back and Cole moved to the stove with his quiet efficiency, and the morning opened around them both. Over the next 2 years, the Hatcher Ranch became one of the most solid operations in the Caldera Creek Valley. This was not dramatic in the way that certain frontier successes were dramatic. There was no single great moment of triumph, no overnight fortune, no cinematic turning point. It was built in the ordinary way that enduring things are built, season by season, with consistent work and honest accounting and the accumulated wisdom of 2 people who were genuinely good at learning. The herd grew to 120 head by 1880. They hired a 4th hand permanently. The main house was expanded with a proper bedroom for James, and an addition off the back that served as a combination study and sitting room, where Elara could work on the accounts while Cole read in the evenings. The Tennyson was worn soft at the spine by now, and had been joined on the shelf by several others, ordered from San Antonio with the same foresight that had produced the first one. Harlan Greer died of a heart complaint in the spring of 1880, and his ranch was sold to a family from Georgia named Brentwood who turned out to be excellent neighbors, friendly and hardworking, with a wife named Lucy who became one of Elara's closest friends, and 3 children who adored James. Clara came from Missouri for a visit in the summer of 1880, which was the first time Elara met her in person, and the 2 women who had been building a friendship through letters for 2 years fell into an immediate, natural ease that confirmed everything the correspondence had suggested. Clara was small and sharp-eyed and funny, and loved her brother with an uncomplicated warmth that included asking him, in Elara's hearing, whether he had told his wife yet that he had written to their father 3 weeks after the wedding to say he thought he'd found something worth keeping. Cole looked at Clara with an expression of mild fraternal exasperation. "Clara," he said. "She should know," Clara said, It was sweet. Elara looked at him. You wrote your father about me 3 weeks after we were married. He looked out at the middle distance with the expression of a man hoping the conversation would move along. I may have. What did you say? Something to the effect that the arrangement was working out better than expected, he said. He said she was the most organized human being he'd ever encountered, Clara said, and that he was learning things. That's a very Cole thing to say about being in love, Elara said. I was not quite in love yet at 3 weeks, Cole said. You were nearly at February, Elara said. Late January, Cole said, and Clara looked between them with bright-eyed delight. James, who was nearly 1 and walking with the unsteady, determined momentum of a small person who had recently discovered the concept of locomotion, pulled himself upright on Cole's knee and looked up at Clara with enormous gray eyes that were entirely his father's. Clara looked at those eyes and made a sound of complete capitulation. He has your face, she told Cole. He looks like a potato, Cole said, and James, apparently satisfied with this assessment, sat back down on the floor and began methodically examining a button he had found near the chair leg. Cole's father, James Sr., wrote a letter that arrived in August, addressed to both of them. It was short and careful in the way of a man who had had a complicated relationship with his words for a long time and was working on being better with them. He said that he was glad for what Cole had built, that he hoped Elara was well, and that he would like to meet his grandson someday if travel ever permitted. He signed it Father, which was not how he usually signed his letters to Cole, who had mentioned this to her once. She read the letter and then looked at her husband. This is a significant letter, she said. Yes, he said quietly. You should write back and say that we would welcome a visit. He looked at her. Are you sure? He's James's grandfather, she said, and I think he's trying. Cole was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. She sat beside him at the table and they wrote the reply together, which was a first for them, Cole providing the words and Elara contributing the warmth, and the letter that resulted was something neither of them could have written alone. In the fall of 1881, Elara found herself expecting again. This time she told Cole at supper on the day she was certain, setting down her fork and looking across at him and saying, I believe we are going to need to think about that small room off the hall. He looked at her, understanding immediately, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, that vast, careful, incredibly gentle expression, though this time it arrived with the additional comfort of experience behind it. Are you well? He said. I am wonderfully well, she said. Then we should expand the room, he said, and went back to his supper with the contentment of a man whose life has arranged itself into something that surpasses what he planned. The second baby arrived in May of 1882, a girl this time, and they named her Clara Marie Hatcher, for the aunt who had written those first warm letters and for Elara's own middle name, and she arrived with the same determination as her brother but with considerably less noise, which Dr. Reeves, now with much steadier hands after a full additional year of better sleep, noted with some approval. Cole held his daughter with the same careful astonishment he had held his son, though by now it was accompanied by a more practiced confidence, and James, who was 2.5 and deeply interested in everything, stood beside his father's knee and looked at the baby with an expression of solemn evaluation. She is small, James announced. You were smaller, Cole said. James considered this with the philosophical depth of a small person confronting a fact that does not match the expected narrative. I was not small, he said firmly. You were very small, Elara said from the bed. You looked like a potato, Cole said, and Elara laughed, and even Dr. Reeves smiled, closing his bag, and James regarded his father with the full dignity of a 2-year-old who is certain he has been mischaracterized. Little Clara had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, which was a combination that would in future years cause considerable comment from everyone who met her. And from the first she was calm and watchful in the way of certain people, who seemed to arrive already understanding something about the world that others spend years learning. Cole's father, James Sr., did come to visit in the spring of 1882, when little Clara was a few weeks old. He arrived by stage from Kansas City, thin and older-looking than his years but clear-eyed and steady, and Cole met the stage in Caldera Creek on a Tuesday morning and brought him back to the ranch in the wagon without much said between them, but without the distance there might have been. Elara had made up the study as a proper guest room and laid out a good supper, and when Cole brought his father in through the door, she saw the older man stop and look at the house, at the solid warm room, at the fire, at the woman coming to meet him with a baby on her hip and a direct, welcoming expression. And she saw something shift in his face the way it does in a person who has been steeling themselves for something, and then found that it isn't what they feared. "Mr. Hatcher," she said and put out her hand. "I'm glad you've come." He took her hand. "James tells me," he said and stopped and tried again. "James tells me you put his name first on the deed." "He built this place," she said. "He deserved to have it acknowledged." Cole's father looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked past her at his son, who was standing in the kitchen doorway watching them both with a steadiness that she recognized as the kind a person maintains when they are feeling too much to express, and the older man said, quietly, "You did well, son." It was a short sentence. In the history of the Hatcher family, and in the long road of the complicated thing between this father and this son, it was not a short sentence at all. Cole nodded once, which communicated everything, and the moment settled into the room and became part of the house. James Sr. stayed 2 weeks. He was good with the children, gentle and patient with young James, and entirely charmed by baby Clara, and he and Cole worked together for several days on a stretch of north fence that needed replacing, which was apparently the perfect context for conversations that would not have happened in a parlor. Elara asked no questions about what was said between them during those fence-building days, but she noticed the change in the quality of the evenings after, the particular ease between them, and she felt, watching them at the supper table, something complete and warm that was beyond happiness, was closer to grace. When the elder James departed on the stage for Kansas City, he embraced his son on the street outside the livery, and held on for a moment longer than was usual. And Elara stood with baby Clara on the boardwalk and watched and was glad, absolutely and fully glad, for every part of the strange, practical, genuine thing that had brought her to this town and this life. The years that followed were the building years, the years that are not dramatic in the telling, but that are the substance of what people mean when they talk about a life that held together. The ranch grew and stabilized into something that did not require constant crisis management, which freed Cole and Elara to think beyond the immediate season and into the longer shape of what they were making. They bought an additional parcel to the north in 1883, doubling their water rights, which was the move that in retrospect made the ranch genuinely prosperous rather than merely solvent. James grew into a serious, curious boy who followed his father around the ranch with the same total attention that Cole brought to everything, and who asked questions constantly, and received them with the full engagement they deserved. He could name every animal in the herd by some characteristic or another by the time he was 4, and was riding his own small horse under supervision by 5. Clara was her own entirely distinct person, quieter than her brother, watching the world with those combined gray eyes that seemed to process everything twice before forming an opinion. She loved the books. By the time she was 3, she was sitting in Cole's lap demanding to be included in the Tennyson readings, and by 4 she could recite several short poems from memory with a precision that made Tobias, still on the ranch and now its senior hand by several years, stare in undisguised awe. "She gets that from you," Cole told Elara one evening after one of these recitations. "She gets the gray eyes from you," Elara said. "The eyes are common enough," Cole said. "The thing she does with information, the way she holds it and organizes it, that's you." She looked at her daughter, who was now carefully rearranging her toys in some system of classification that was not immediately obvious to anyone else. "I suppose," she said. "It's a very good trait," Cole said, and he said it the way he had always said true things about her, simply and without embellishment, and she leaned against his shoulder on the settee and felt the Caldera Creek evening settle into the house around them, warm and quiet and full. There were hard seasons. A drought year in 1884 that required every piece of careful range management Cole knew and still cost them a portion of the herd. A winter in 1885 that was savage enough to test the structures of everything they had built. A period of difficulty, with a new set of land office records that required Walcott's services again and cost them time and money and peace of mind. Life in the valley was not a resolved thing, not a finished thing, and they both knew that, and neither of them required it to be otherwise. What they had built between them was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something strong enough to bear it. The trust that had been built in that first year of transactional honesty had grown into something that was not diminished by disagreement or pressure but actually clarified by it. They argued still about cattle management and money and the proper way to handle young James's tendency toward stubbornness, which Cole thought should be redirected and Elara thought should be channeled. And the fact that they were both right about different aspects of the same child was a source of ongoing negotiation that was never not a little funny. They were, as she had said on the night they acknowledged everything at the kitchen table, a good team. They were the best kind of team, which was the kind that was made of two complete people rather than two halves of one person, each maintaining their own clear view of things and choosing daily to bring those views together in the service of something larger than either alone. By 1886, Caldera Creek had grown with it, as towns did in those years, shaped by the railroad spur that had come through in 1883 and brought commerce and newcomers and a level of activity that had seemed impossible in the quiet, bluff-ringed valley of the late 1870s. There was a proper hotel now and a real school, and a doctor who had trained in Philadelphia and whose hands were entirely steady, which was a development that Elara had welcomed with considerable feeling. Mrs. Potts had retired from her correspondence but still sent quilts for every Hatcher birthday. Walcott had taken on a partner who seemed likely to be just as methodical and was also, happily, 20 years younger. Tobias had married in 1884. A woman named Dora from the next county who was brisk and kind, and ran their household with an efficiency that Tobias regarded with a mix of admiration and mild terror that everyone around them found endearing. He still worked the Hatcher ranch, now as foreman, a position he had grown into with the same wholehearted competence he had brought to everything since the first day. Eli had moved on 2 years earlier, taken a foreman position on a ranch in New Mexico where he was, by all reports, thriving. Holt was still on the ranch, quiet and reliable as good timber. In the spring of 1886, Elara stood at the kitchen window on a morning in April and watched Cole come in from the range with James, who was 6 now, and riding properly and already asking questions about the herd management that Cole answered with the same careful thoroughness he had used with Tobias all those years before on the cold lunch break where everything had begun. Though of course James was the person who mattered most in the world, and the answers therefore had an additional dimension of love in them. She watched them dismount together at the paddock fence, the tall man and the small serious boy, and she thought about the morning in December of 1878 when she had sat beside a stranger in a cold chapel and said the plain truth to him, and he had received it with a quiet that turned out to be not resignation but depth. She thought about all the ways a practical decision could grow into something that neither practicality nor decision adequately described. She heard little Clara come pattering down the hall in her morning bare feet and felt the small, warm weight of her daughter lean against her legs, and she looked down at the gray eyes looking up at her. "Is Papa coming in?" Clara asked. "He's coming," Elara said. "I want to show him I learned the next poem," Clara said. "The one with the brook." "Show me first," Elara said. Clara drew herself upright in the way she had, pulled her nightgown straight, and began reciting with perfect seriousness, a brook babbling through Tennyson's syllables in the voice of a 4-year-old who was entirely certain of herself. Elara listened and felt the morning fill up with it, the recitation and the sun coming through the window, and the sound of her son's voice outside talking to Cole about something urgent and small boy important, and the smell of the coffee starting on the stove, and the land beyond the window green and spreading and entirely theirs. When the back door opened and Cole came in with James on his heels, she was still at the window, and Cole stopped and looked at her the way he always did first, just checking, the habit of 8 years that had never left him, and that she had come to understand as his particular form of love language, this quiet, constant acknowledgement of her presence. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Clara launched her poem at him before he had taken his boots off, and he sat down on the bench by the door in his socks and his coat and listened to the whole thing with absolute attention, and when it was done he said, all of it. You remembered all of it, and the pride in his voice was real and undecorated. "Can I learn the whole book?" Clara asked. "We can try," Cole said. James was already at the kitchen table telling his mother about the thing he had noticed about one of the cows on the east pasture, something about the way she was standing that he thought might mean she was getting ready to deliver, which was an observation that Elara suspected was accurate based on everything Cole had taught him. She listened to her son and watched her husband settle Clara against his side on the bench and open the worn Tennyson to find the next poem, and she felt, in the ordinary morning light, the totality of what had been built here from such austere beginnings. She had married a man she did not know for a piece of land she needed to save. He had known it. He had said that was fine. And the quiet that had held him when he said it was not the quiet of a man diminished by transactional arrangements, but the quiet of a man who understood that things grow in the right conditions, that you create the conditions and you wait and you work, and you do not force the growing, and that what comes from honest soil honestly tended is worth more than anything arranged from the outside in. She crossed the kitchen and bent and kissed the top of his head, which was still hatless at this hour. His dark hair shot through at the temple now with the silver that had started coming in last year, and that she found, unreasonably, completely beautiful. He looked up at her with those gray eyes, uncomplicated and entirely present. "What was that for?" he said. "For being you," she said, which was what he had once given her, plainly and without embellishment, and she returned it in kind because it was the exact truth. He held her gaze for a moment with that expression she had first seen in full across a kitchen table by lamplight, that open, undefended, careful and enormous thing, and then he put his arm around her briefly and returned to the poem, and to their daughter who was waiting with her small face tipped up, ready for the next stanza. James reached over from the table and took a biscuit from the basket and began eating it with focused contentment. Elara made the coffee. The morning moved through the house and out across the ranch in the valley, through the green spring grass and the red bluffs in the distance, and the wide Texas sky that held everything without preference or judgment, enormous and blue, and entirely indifferent to the small, beautiful fact of a life that had turned out, against considerable odds and through considerable work, exactly right.